Hi, I'm Rebecca Gross, and I'll be talking today about the dark side of leadership. I'm going to be discussing why we should look at bad leadership, approaches used to study effective leadership, and a few categories of bad leadership. I'm going to discuss what this particular study looked at, the methodology and sample that was used, as well as the 10 questions composed for the survey, what was found, and the results obtained from those findings. I will also be talking about some behaviors that lead an employee to classify a leader as bad and the negative effects bad leadership has on subordinates. Lastly, I will review some issues presented by the study, my overall impressions of the research quality, and some implications of the research. The purpose of this study is to identify what constitutes bad leadership, whether bad leadership is the opposite or absence of good leadership traits and behaviors, or if it is entirely a different entity. Another purpose is to understand leadership thoroughly, as it should be studied from all angles, not just the effective one. Lastly, we have as much to learn from bad examples of leaders as we do from good examples. Taking a look at the 5 approaches to study effective leadership, TRAIT attempts to define, explain, and predict effective leaders in terms of innate personality characteristics and abilities. Behavioral identifies specific behavior patterns associated with effective leadership. Contingency determines when, given the circumstances, each specific behavioral approach was most effective. Leadership member exchange theory is how leaders develop different relationships with their followers. A neo-charismatic is where characteristics of behaviors of leaders are described as visionary and whose effects on followers are profound. Using Killerman's 7-category typology of bad leadership from his book Bad Leadership, What It Is, How It Happens, and Why It Matters, the types of bad leaders include incompetent leadership, or leaders who lack the will and skill to sustain effective action and did not create positive change. Rigid leadership is a stiff and unyielding leader who is unwilling to adapt to change. Intemperate leadership is a leader who lacks self-control and whose followers are unwilling to intervene. Callous leadership is an uncaring or unkind leader who ignored or discounted the needs and wants of followers. Corrupt leadership is a leader who lied, cheated, and/or stole. Insular leadership is leaders who minimize or disregard the welfare of subordinates, and evil leadership, which includes leaders who have committed physical, mental harm, or atrocities. The study looks at the prevalence of bad leaders, behaviors causing a leader to be perceived as bad, impacts of bad leaders on the employee and organization, whether these bad leaders have always been bad, and what happens to the bad leader. The study was completed using a web-based survey. 21 items were addressed concerning the antecedents, behaviors, and outcomes associated with bad leadership as perceived by followers. Narrative responses were broken down into meaningful single-idea units and were further categorized to represent common themes. 335 individuals took part in this survey. The average respondent was in their mid-40s. 70% of leaders described were male, while 63% of respondents were female. 43.9% were Australian and 27.4% were American, while 76.6% possessed undergraduate or postgraduate degrees. The following are 7 of the 10 questions presented in the survey and the significant responses to them. When asked what significant actions led to the classification of a leader as poor, 17.6% stated a lack of the leader's ability to deal effectively with subordinates. 14.1% stated poor personal behavior as the cause, while 13.3% indicated poor ethics and integrity led them to label a leader as such. When asked how this bad leader makes you feel, 15% stated it left them angry. 13.9% indicated a lowered self-view and lowered self-esteem, while 11.6% said bad leadership left them feeling frustrated. When asked what effect the bad leader had on work performance, 33.6% indicated a loss of motivation, 9.8% indicated a general decrease in performance, while 8.9% reported negative egocentric behavior. When inquired about the effect a bad leader had on them personally, 29.3% indicated it increased their stress, 15.9% simply indicated that it had a negative effect on them, and 15% also reported negative effects on non-work life. When asked what effect the bad leader had on the organization, 21.3% indicated a human resources loss, 17.3% said it created bad organizational culture, while 16% said the organization experienced a performance loss. When asked how bad leadership developed over time, 28.2% of respondents reported a skills mismatch, 16.9% offered that a situation or other people caused too much pressure, and 16.9% also said the behavior was self-focused or political. Lastly, when asked what happened to the bad leader, 44.8% actually said the bad leader was promoted or rewarded, while 19.4% said that nothing happened, and only 13.4% said the leader was forced out or punished. What was found was that 24.2% of leaders were considered good, while 37.6% were considered average, and 37.4% of leaders were considered bad or poor. The perceived prevalence of bad leaders was rated on a scale ranging from 1 to 7, with 1 being bad and 7 being good. The average rating reported was a 2.5. The perception that work colleagues shared the notion that a particular leader was bad was rated on a scale ranging from 0, meaning no one, to 3, meaning everyone. The average rating reported was a 2.4. A summary of the results finds that younger subordinates and subordinates of women leaders are more than twice as likely to consider their bad leaders autocratic. Subordinates under the age of 36 were more likely to describe their bad leaders as micromanagers, while subordinates with older leaders were more likely to feel disloyal or embarrassed. The older subordinates were more likely to label a good leader's transition to bad as a skill mismatch. The leader's gender and subordinate's gender had no apparent impact on the way bad leaders were described. There's a fairly universal perception of bad leaders across all types of individual subordinates. When a leader is perceived as bad by one member of an organization, that opinion is perceived to be widely held by other members of the organization as well. And finally, a strong consensus and consistency in presented concerning the prevalence of bad leaders in the workplace. Behaviors that lead an employee to classify a leader as bad include consistently failing to motivate and appropriately reward staff. These leaders do not professionally develop staff, recognize them as people, or understand their strengths and weaknesses. Poor role modeling was also cited, as good leaders influence followers by example in the behaviors, attitudes, morals, and emotions that they display. Poor personal behavior of a leader was often responsible for the perception that he or she was bad. Leaders in this survey were labeled as bad if they were perceived as lacking honesty or integrity. Effects this has on subordinates include negative emotional reactions, stress, lowered self-esteem, and a loss of self-confidence. It affected the personal lives of followers, including family stability, personal relationships, and health. Individual performance at work was affected with consequences such as a failure to achieve optimal work performance, loss of employee motivation and performance, increase in avoidance behaviors by subordinates, an increase in human resource costs for the company, and an increase in subordinate absenteeism and turnover. Issues with the study include the response of a smaller sample size than thought, the fact that individuals frustrated with bad leaders are highly motivated to vent on such matters. Many of the respondents were describing a leader they had encountered in the past, and memories can be unreliable and perhaps polarized. Also, the results can be biased upward as a result of the recruiting communication and introductory comments. Overall, my impressions of the research quality was good. Survey questions encompassed the consequence spectrum of bad leaders. The study ultimately adopted a dichotomous scoring scheme which eliminated multiple single idea statements in one category for more expressive individuals. To improve the sample, this questionnaire could possibly be brought into a workplace or added to a climate survey. The implications of this study were that the perceived prevalence of bad leaders in the workplace is high and more research is needed on this topic. A number of behaviors that cause leaders to be perceived as bad were identified, which are important to maintain a more complete awareness of the study of leadership. Leadership development focuses on teaching aspiring leaders how they should behave. Teaching them also how not to behave or how not to be seen as a bad leader is equally as important. The study proved a need to identify and deal with problem leaders at an early stage, and lastly, bad leaders represent a legitimate problem. From this study, we learned that bad leaders have devastating consequences on their followers, both physically and emotionally, within their work as well as their social life. Organizations are affected through productivity, morale, motivation, and creativity, and more consideration should be made regarding the study and implications of bad leadership.